Hello and welcome to another GCSE History revision tutorial. Today we're going to look at the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. So the first thing to remember here is that the collapse of the USSR did not happen in one day. It was a process which happened over a longer period of time. So it's helpful to start by looking at the big picture. A good way to make sense of it is to divide this period in two. Firstly, in the 1980s, we have a period which we'll call the Second Cold War. The starting point for this was when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, triggering the end of détente with the USA. Now, the USA strongly criticised the Soviet invasion and responded with the Carter Doctrine, promising to contain the spread of communism in the region around Afghanistan. President Carter withdrew the SALT II Treaty from Congress, and the USA boycotted the Moscow Olympic Games. The Soviets retaliated 4 years later in Los Angeles. Now, the Second Cold War really got going with the election of President Reagan. He used tough language against the USSR, calling it an evil empire. And he raised weapons spending, hoping to draw the USSR into a new arms race, which it could not afford. In 1983, the Soviets panicked when Reagan announced that the USA was developing a missile shield in space called the Strategic Defense Initiative. Now, while all this was going on in the USA, the USSR went through a period of poor leadership, as Brezhnev was replaced first by Andropov and then Chernenko. These ageing leaders held office briefly without making reforms or planning for the future, so the Soviet economy continued to weaken and stagnate. These troubles helped to bring a reformer to power in the USSR, Mikhail Gorbachev. He introduced a collection of reforms which we'll call New Thinking. His intention was to save communism by making the necessary changes, but his policies actually contributed to its collapse. His priority was ending the arms race with the USA, and this he achieved in a series of summit meetings at which he and Reagan were able to reach agreement. The most important of these summit meetings was the Washington Summit, at which the INF Treaty was signed, with both sides agreeing in that treaty to give up their medium-range nuclear missiles. However, through the later 1980s, protests swept through Eastern Europe, and Gorbachev was unwilling to intervene to put these protests down. And this led to the end of communist rule in the satellite states. The most famous moment in this was the fall of the Berlin Wall itself, which became a symbol of the collapse of Soviet rule in Eastern Europe. In 1991, the members of the Warsaw Pact met to dissolve their military alliance, and that was followed later that year by Gorbachev dissolving the USSR itself. Now, in the next part of this video, we'll look a little closer at 5 of the key moments in the collapse of the Soviet Union. Let's look first at Gorbachev's new thinking. So why did Gorbachev believe that reforms were necessary? Ultimately, this is because the USSR was under a great deal of economic, political and military pressure. In economic terms, the Soviet Union was struggling. Previous Soviet leaders had not been able to grow the economy, so now it was unable to afford the huge costs of the arms race with the USA. It was also being drained by the cost of the Afghanistan war, which was costing billions every year. In military terms, the Soviet army was caught up in Afghanistan, unable to win the war and draining its military resources. Furthermore, the Soviet military lacked the technology and the funding to keep up with Reagan's weapons spending and Reagan's SDI program, which relied on advanced computer technology that the USSR simply did not have. Politically, the Soviet Union was also under pressure. The Brezhnev Doctrine had put a stop to any reforms in satellite states, so their economies had stagnated and living standards were low. This was now causing discontent in the satellite states and even protests. The Soviets were particularly worried about Poland, where a trade union called Solidarity had become the major source of opposition to the communist government. So Gorbachev declared publicly that the USSR could not go on like this. He made a series of reforms to try and solve the Soviet Union's underlying problems. First, perestroika. This means reorganising the economy to allow some capitalist ideas. This included, for example, permitting some private businesses to trade for a profit, like hotels, restaurants and hairdressers. Ultimately, this led to the opening of the first McDonald's in Moscow. Secondly, glasnost, which means transparency. Instead of dealing with problems in the communist system, previous communist leaders had covered up these problems and prevented people from criticising the government. Gorbachev pledged to be more open with the people, to reduce censorship and to allow more freedom of speech. He hoped that this would reduce corruption and it would lead to improvements in how the government worked. Thirdly, he pledged to reduce weapons spending and withdraw from Afghanistan. And finally, he announced an end to the Brezhnev Doctrine. Now, this was hugely significant. Gorbachev made it clear that the USSR would no longer intervene to stop reforms happening in satellite states. Gorbachev's new thinking began a chain of events which led to the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the USSR. Firstly, it was clear that he was an entirely different kind of leader to previous Soviet leaders. Western leaders, including Reagan, saw that they could work with Gorbachev, and it was this which led to the summit meetings with Reagan in the mid-1980s, and ultimately to the 1987 Washington summit, at which the INF Treaty was signed. Now, this treaty mattered because, unlike previous weapons treaties like SALT, which set limits on weapons, the INF Treaty agreed that both sides would actually get rid of their medium-range missiles. And this was the first time that they had actually agreed to reduce their weapons stocks. Secondly, Gorbachev's reforms sent a clear message to people in the satellite states that he would not prevent them introducing reforms of their own. Now, this encouraged protesters and reformers across Eastern Europe who saw it as an opportunity to break free from the Soviet Union's grip. And that leads us to our next event, widespread protests across Eastern Europe. These broke out in the later 1980s for three reasons. First, the lack of reforms in satellite states had stopped their economies from growing. This meant that living standards in the satellite states were lower than those in Western Europe. And thanks to satellite television and other forms of media, people in the East were able to see for themselves how much better life was in the capitalist West. And this made them demand reforms in their own countries. Thirdly, Gorbachev's new thinking made it clear that the Soviet Union would not stop people in Eastern Europe from demanding their own reforms. As a result, major protests broke out in the satellite states, beginning with Poland and Hungary, and then later Romania. These protests spread across Eastern Europe, and one by one communist regimes were overthrown. Now, for the most part, this was peaceful, as the communist parties accepted demands for free elections. However, Romania was an exception. There, communism had a much more violent end, as the dictator Ceausescu refused to give up power and, in the end, was captured and put to death by firing squad. These protests had huge importance for the Cold War. Firstly, the Soviets lost control of Eastern Europe, which had been under their grip since the 1940s. Secondly, as a result of these protests, Hungary opened its border with Austria, creating a gap in the Iron Curtain. This meant that the Berlin Wall no longer served its purpose of preventing travel to the West. East Germans, for example, began travelling to Hungary on holiday and then slipping across the border to escape to the West. Now, as the satellite states rejected communism, the Warsaw Pact lost its purpose. It existed as a defensive alliance of communist countries, but now those countries had rejected communism. Finally, the loss of Eastern Europe damaged Gorbachev's authority in the Soviet Union. In the West, he was treated as a hero, but in the USSR itself, he was now seen as the man who lost Eastern Europe. And this lost him the support of Soviet military leaders. Now, of all the protests in Eastern Europe, the ones in East Germany are worthy of particular attention for us. So let's zoom in for a moment on the fall of the Berlin Wall. Firstly, why did the wall fall? Well, there were two main reasons here. Firstly, the protests, which had begun in Poland and Hungary, spread quickly to East Germany, with as many as 1 million people taking to the streets by November 1989. Secondly, when the East German government asked for Gorbachev's help to put down the protests, he refused. At this crucial moment, the USSR would not intervene to prop up the East German communist government. Under pressure from the crowds, the East German government announced that travel to the West would be made easier. Now, East Germans expected this to happen immediately, so they flocked to the wall in large numbers. The border guards there lacked clear instructions to deal with this, so they panicked and they opened the border crossings. The crowd streamed across the border and began tearing down the wall. Now, although the fall of the wall was not the first gap in the Iron Curtain, remember, Hungary had already opened its border with Austria, nevertheless, the wall had huge importance for the Cold War. Firstly, its fall was symbolic. For 30 years, the wall had symbolised the Cold War division between East and West. And now the fall of the wall became a powerful symbol of the end of Soviet control and the end of the Cold War. Secondly, the fall of the wall added further momentum to events happening across Eastern Europe. It encouraged further protests, which led to the fall of communist governments in Bulgaria and in Romania. Finally, the fall of the wall opened the way for the reunification of Germany, which happened in October 1990. That meant that there were no longer two separate Germanys on the map, but one united Germany. We can build on this by looking at the end of the Warsaw Pact. Now, as the Eastern European countries rejected communism, the Warsaw Pact no longer had a purpose. So, the leaders of the countries involved met in 1991 and they dissolved the pact. This was another sign that the Cold War was ending. The dissolution of the Warsaw Pact ended the military division of Europe. Only one of the two great Cold War military alliances remained, NATO. And all of the former Eastern satellite states eventually joined NATO as a way of guaranteeing their safety from Russia in future. Now that there were no longer two hostile military alliances in Europe, tensions on the continent decreased. But once again, while Gorbachev was seen as a hero in the West for allowing this to happen, these events damaged his authority in the USSR. He was now seen by Soviet military leaders as the man who lost the Warsaw Pact. And that finally brings us to the breakup of the USSR itself. The causes here are both long and short term. In the long term, the USSR was in decline, both economically and militarily. It did not have the resources to compete with the West or to maintain Soviet rule in Eastern Europe. In the medium term, Gorbachev's new thinking had failed to fix the Soviet economy. And in the short term, Gorbachev's authority as Soviet leader had been badly damaged by the loss of Eastern Europe. So the course of events went something like this. Soviet military leaders turned against Gorbachev and tried to remove him. They failed. However, it was clear that Gorbachev no longer had the support of his own military. This encouraged the individual republics of the USSR to start declaring their independence. So parts of the USSR began to break away. The first to do this were the Baltic states like Latvia and Estonia, but other republics like Ukraine and Georgia soon followed. Gorbachev was in no position to stop this. He lacked the authority, and he lacked the economic and military resources to prevent this. So he accepted it, and at the end of 1991 he announced he was dissolving the USSR. This mattered because it meant that the USSR ceased to exist as a country. It broke up into separate states. And with the Soviet Union gone and communist rule ended, the Cold War was now finally over. If you'd like to develop your understanding of this a little further, here are 2 tasks that you could have a go at. If you found this video helpful, then please don't forget to give the video a like and to subscribe to our channel, where you'll find lots of other GCSE history revision tutorials to help you.